Many Christians claim that Genesis 1 was written as an historical account of the creation of the world and the universe. They go on to assert that the Bible teaches that the universe and the earth were created in 6 literal 24-hour days. Many atheists also claim that Genesis 1 was written as an historical account, and they use that gleefully as prime evidence that the Bible is false. But maybe both the young earth creationist Christians and many atheists are reading the text incorrectly. I don't think Genesis 1 was written to be a blow-by-blow scientific accounting of the creation of the world. Stick around for an alternative and better explanation. Hey there, I'm John and welcome to my channel. We believe that you can be a Christian, a committed follower of Jesus, and not reject modern science. This video is based upon a small portion of my book, Creation and the Flood. I've linked to it in the description below. Now, there are lots of different types of writing in the Bible. There's historical narrative and poetry and prophecy and apocalyptic literature and so much more. The richness and diversity of the writing in the Bible is awesome. And it is important to pick up on what type of literature we are reading if we want to understand a passage correctly. And we really need to get the genre of Genesis 1 correct. Believers struggle with this. I struggled with the genre of Genesis 1 for a time because I read it as describing literal history, but I knew the earth was old. It actually led to a faith crisis. And this is also important for evangelism because we don't want to go around telling potential believers the Bible teaches things they know are not true. It makes it harder to convince them that Christianity is true. So let's dig in. First, should we expect, before reading it, that Genesis 1 is literal or metaphorical? I think the latter. As Christy Hemphill points out, conceptual metaphors are useful for explaining things that are at the edge of or beyond the limits of the reader's immediate senses, allowing the reader to grasp key concepts. This is a key reason for the use of metaphor in the Bible. Well, the events and subjects of Genesis 1 definitely qualify as beyond the limits of the immediate senses of the ancient Near Eastern reader. Creation of the universe, creation of plant and animal life, the nature of God, God's relationship to the world and to us, all of these are beyond the limits of the senses of the ancient Near Eastern reader. But let's, of course, consider the proposal that Genesis 1 is history. Many say that it reads like narrative, so it must be an historical account. But oftentimes a story, especially a good story, will read like narrative. And how do we tell which it is? Well, if you have a passage that you think may be an historical account, and you want to verify if it is an historical account, you can just go back and see if the events in the passage actually happened in history as the passage says they did. And we can do this with Genesis 1. We can see if the earth was created in 6 days. Now we know from an overwhelming amount of science that the world was not created in 6 days. So Genesis 1 is not history. What we really need to do is to get at the intention of the author. What was he trying to do? There are plenty of clues, if we dig a bit, to show us that he wasn't merely trying and failing to write history. There's a lot more going on. And we can see that the author employed metaphorical language, and we can get a sense of the genre. One clue is the prose. It is not plain. It is exalted. Take a look at the creation of man from day 6. I'll read from my 1611 edition King James Bible. And God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him. Male and female created he them. And God blessed them. And God said unto them, "Be fruitful, and multiply, and replenish the earth, and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth." And indeed there is poetry in verse 27. As Kenneth Mathews points out, the construction of verse 27 is an embedded poem consisting of 3 lines, with lines 1 and 2 in chiastic arrangement, meaning using inverted repetition, and the last line in explication. Another clue that the author is employing metaphorical language and not reporting straight history is the structure of the chapter. The structure itself is artistic. In particular, the arrangement of the 6 days is symmetrical. Briefly, In days 1, 2, and 3, God creates realms, and then in days 4, 5, and 6, God fills the corresponding realm. This is called the framework hypothesis, which goes back to the late 1700s and is now well accepted. Another clue that Genesis 1 is artful and not literal is the numerical symbolism in the passage, in particular the prevalence of the number 7. As Denis Lamoureux explains, this number in the ancient Near East was considered special and carried a sense of completion, fulfillment, and perfection. Gordon Wenham points out that in the Hebrew, verse 1 has 7 words, and verse 2 has 14 words, a multiple of 7. The end of the passage, chapter 2, verses 1 to 3, has 35 words, also a multiple of 7. God is mentioned 35 times, earth 21 times, heaven or firmament 21 times, and it was so is repeated 7 times, and God saw that it was good occurs 7 times as well. Now the grammar of the passage, particularly the first line, also clues us in that the author is doing something special here. I'll have more to say on this in a future video, but for now I'll note that, as Ben Stanhope explains, many modern scholars think the best translation of the first 3 verses goes something like this. When God began to create the heaven and earth, the earth being unformed and void, with darkness over the face of the deep and a wind from God sweeping over the water, God said, "Let there be light." This is one long sentence with multiple clauses, starting with God forming the earth out of pre-existing material, then adding parenthetical information, and ending with a declaration. This style of writing is very similar to how other creation accounts in the ancient Near East opened. The most prominent of these creation myths, the Enuma Elish, which is older than Genesis, begins as follows, with the first sentence being, "When above the heavens had not yet been named, and below the earth had not yet been called by a name." And then there's a bunch of parenthetical information, including something akin to the earth being formless. It reads, "And no pasture had been formed, and not even a reed marsh was to be seen." And then the sentence ends with a declaration of creation. It reads, "At that time were the gods created within them." The structure here, the structural similarities with Genesis, are striking. So the author of Genesis 1 is writing in the style of how creation myths were begun back in that day. And as Joel Edmund Anderson opines, no one in the ancient world read myths as having literally happened in history. I'll add that I believe the ancient myths were, however, intended to impart truth. Myths were how deep truths were communicated back in that day. But it becomes clear as we dig into the text of Genesis 1, and as we will do in coming videos, that the author was not copying the Enuma Elish. Rather, he was in conversation with it and with the ancient Near Eastern culture in general. Genesis 1 can be seen as a polemic over and against the pagan religions of Israel's neighbors. Genesis 1 is a national anthem of sorts for the Israelites. What are some of the lessons? To be very brief, as I'll explore these issues in further videos, one lesson is that the entire earth is God's temple. That may indeed be behind the use of the 6 creation days followed by a day of rest. As Ian Provan explains, it is critical here to remember the close connection between temple and cosmos in the ancient mind and the marked similarity between how ancient Near Eastern texts concerning the making of the world and those considering the construction of temples. In both kinds of text, a story is told of the emergence of a stable and ordered environment in which divinity could find rest, enjoying, along with his worshippers, the peace and security of the cosmos. The temple dedication ceremonies that ended in this divine rest often lasted 7 days. That the entire earth was God's temple would be in stark contrast to the theology of the surrounding cultures. Other differences between Genesis 1 and the ancient Near East creation myths, and pointed lessons that Genesis 1 teaches, include that there is only one God. Also that Yahweh is God of all, superior to the gods of other nations, which are not actually gods at all. Also, man is special, made in God's image for relationship with him, not, as in the myths, to do work for the gods, and so forth. So at the end of the day, what is the genre of Genesis 1? If forced to give an answer, I may reply ancient mythology, stressing, however, that myths were how cultures conveyed deep truths back in ancient times. But perhaps mythohistory, a term I believe was coined by scholar Thorkild Jakobsen, may be the best fit. Early Genesis talks about real things, like the creation of the world, but in figurative terms. Now, scholars I respect give various answers to this question of genre. Gordon Wenham calls early Genesis proto-history, which is not ordinary history yet not fiction either. Kenton Sparks characterizes Genesis 1-11 as ancient historiography, where the intent was not to precisely relay events that occurred in space and time. John Walton and Tremper Longman III opine that the genre of Genesis is theological history, which speaks of events that actually happened, while selecting and interpreting those events according to the purpose of the author. Denis Lamoureux, in a quote he attributes to J.I. Packer, describes Genesis as written in picture language. Klaus Westermann notes that Genesis 1 contains a fusion of poetry and prose that is unique in the Old Testament. And Bruce Walke opines that Genesis is literature because it communicates doctrine in an artful way. It is ideological art. The narrator uses words not as a stick, but as a web. He teaches by telling stories. In the end, what is important is the recognition that Genesis 1 provides, in a non-literal manner, deep truths which help form the foundation for the entirety of Scripture. Well, that's it for now. If you enjoyed the content, consider subscribing and don't forget to hit the like button. And also consider my book, Creation and the Flood, which explores Genesis 1 in great depth.